Welcome to How to Become a Production SQL Database Administrator. My name is Raphael. So we have configured the domain controller and did all the settings and IP address and so forth. In this video now, I'm going to actually create a second virtual machine, which is going to be very similar to what we did with the domain controller, except we're not going to promote it to a domain controller. It's going to be a standalone server. And then we're going to join the domain, the SQL domain, and I'll show you how to do that and some of the issues that you may have when doing this. So let's quickly go to our virtual machine and start this process all over again. So let's go to our server manager and again, go to new. Now again, this is nothing going to be dissimilar that we did. We're going to select the same things that we did for the domain controller. We're going to select the appropriate version, which is 2012 64-bit. And we're just going to call this server 1. And that's good enough. And go next. Next. Now I'm going to be a little quicker on this particular case because we've already gone through this process. And as I said, it's going to be no dissimilar than what we're doing. We'll leave it at 25 gigs. That's fine. And we're going to start. And I'm going to pause this video and let this go through because you've seen this process before. So once we get it, we'll have a separate, another instance of a virtual machine that we can configure, and then we're going to join the domain called SQL. So that's an important concept to understand. So I'm going to pause this video, and what we're going to do actually is create a second machine, add the operating system, and then I'm going to join it, and then we'll start talking about SQL Server, which were the whole idea of this short tutorials or the short course is to get to the stage where we're working with SQL Server environment. The whole reason why we're doing this entire process here of creating utilizing VirtualBox, creating a virtual machine, installing operating systems, creating a domain controller, is that so you have a platform to work with and to emulate real life production. You're not going to be installing this on your local computer because if you install the SQL Windows operating system, it will overwrite your operating system. So we want it to be entirely separate. And this is the whole premise. And this is what we're getting to the stage where we can now install SQL and understand what SQL Server is about. So let's go back to see where we are. And it's got 1 minute. So let me just see. It seems to be going a little faster. So I may continue doing with it. Let's just see if it quickly elapses or not. So as I said, you're getting a tremendous amount of information here. What I'm encouraging you to do is, this is the ultimate guide in becoming an SQL database administrator. But note, this is just an introduction to it. I've got 8 courses, or will have 10 courses dedicated to becoming an SQL DB and all the courses that you all need to become that. This is just a sample. So I'm hoping you can appreciate what you'll be learning if this is just a sample when you actually take the courses. And I'll be going over those when we get to it. So let me look at the progress of this. It's almost done, so we'll just keep with it. And once this is created, what we'll have is just like here, we'll have another instance of a VM. And then we're going to configure it just like we did with the Windows operating system. At that point, I will pause it. This seems to be going a little faster than the previous version because actually it was only 25 gigs as opposed to 35 gigs. And that's what I mean by the larger the hard drive you allocate, the longer it takes. That 10 gigs is saving us some time. So this is almost done. And there we go. So now we're on. So we're going to start and power it on. And we're going to go through the same process that we did just before with Windows OS. We're going to navigate to the operating system. So there it is, and go OK or open. And I'm going to start. And at this point, when we do start the installation, as you know, this is going to take a few minutes. So at this point, I will pause and come back. But as you'll notice that it's going to be virtually identical to what we did for the previous OS, Windows OS. And see, as you can see, it's identical. So at this point, you're going to become an expert at installing Windows 2012. So I'm going to pause this video right now so you know what's going to happen. At this point, it's going to install the operating system, and then we're going to get to the state where let's choose this one. Next. And you should be able to direct me to now what we're doing because it's relatively simple. And let's go to custom, select that. And as soon as this starts, I'm going to pause it. So now I am going to pause the video, and when this comes up to the page of adding the password to the administrator, we'll do that. So I'm going to pause this, and we'll see you in a second. And we're back, and as you can see, this is the setting for the password. So I'm going to use the same password for this server as I did before, not to confuse. So let's start again. Word. And like previously, make sure you remember the password if you give it a different password. So let's finish this. And as I said, it's going to be nothing dissimilar to what you've seen before when we created the domain controller. It's virtually identical at this point. And all I'm going to do to this one now is just change a few configurations like the firewall setting, give it an IP address, and that's it. And then the next thing we're going to do is start installing, we're going to join this domain. We're going to join the domain. Once we join the domain and it's part of SQL domain, this standalone server will now host the SQL 2014. And I'm going to show you how to install the SQL server on this particular machine. So let's just look at this while this doing this. And let's look at so right now we're doing this. And we're going to be joining a domain. And I'm going to go over this a little more in detail because if you do have an issue of joining a domain, I'm going to show you some of the reasons you may be having difficulty joining the domain and how to resolve those. So this is going to be an important concept to understand when you're creating a second server and joining it. So there it is. So let's go to Input, Keyboard, and let's join. And right now you can see it's not part of the SQL because there's no SQL /. This is still a standalone server. So the first thing we need to do in order to get part of it is join it. So let's start. And let's go 1, 2, 3. And let's look at our view, the whole thing here. And go switch. And just like the other server, we're going to have to change some properties here. And I'll point out a couple of things here. As you can see, the network internet access, but it's not part of SQL. It's a standalone. We're going to get the SQL manager popping up, so we're going to have to resolve that also, just like we did before. So there's a few things we need to do to this particular instance also. So let's look at what they are. So let's go to our local. Well, let's just look at this. Let's change the pop-up so we don't get the pop-up. Left click. And it should take a second for the drop-down list. So we don't and go to server properties. And the great thing is that as you do this redundantly with the other servers, if you wanted to add another server, you would do exactly the same thing we've been doing with this one and just repeat the process. So now go to local. And go to firewall, and it's on, so turn it off. Now I'm going to turn this off, and go OK. Same thing. This is off, as you can see. Same thing with the IE. I'm going to turn it off and go OK. Now this is one of the reasons where some of the students had issues here, and we're going to go close this. And right now you can see we can access the internet, but it's not part of the SQL server, SQL domain. So what we need to do now is join the domain. So the way you do that is right click here. Now, one thing I want you to note is that I did turn off the firewall and we're going to join the domain. So if we have an issue, it could be the firewall is disabled again when we join the domain. So that's one thing I want you to note, and that's why I'm deliberately pointing it out. So one thing it is that I want you to join the domain, and the way to do that now is as follows. Go to your folder here, right-click, Properties, and as you can see, it's part of the workstation. It's not part of the domain. So in order to join the domain, you're going to go Settings, Change, Domain, and now we're going to go SQL. because that's the domain name. Go OK. And a Windows server should pop up. Whoops, let's call it .com. Well, let's join the static IP addresses first before we do that, so it knows how to resolve those DNS. So what I want you to do actually is a couple of things here. So the first thing I want you to do is actually, let's look at this. Let's go to View, Full Scale. Let's go back to our manager and make sure you select the appropriate one. Go to Server, go to Network. And just like we changed the NAT, we're going to use the bridged and go OK. And it'll just take a second. As you can see, it's done. That's one thing I want you to do. The other thing is I want you to go back to the